Well, my name's Len Yelinek. I was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. I was in Vietnam from October of 1968 till about October of 1969. With a 2 months absence, I spent in the U.S. Navy hospital in Yokosuka, Japan, where I, as a result of injuries where I got the Purple Heart. I was the public affairs officer for the River Patrol Force. You may have heard the term the Brown Water Navy. Well, that was us. In the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, there were really no rivers, no highways and roads. The inhabitants got around by sampan. The Viet Cong got around by sampan. So our job was to interdict the Viet Cong and keep the waterway safe for the Vietnamese citizens. I was the very first public affairs officer for the River Patrol Force. I had been the officer in charge of Armed Forces Television in Puerto Rico and was asked to go to Vietnam, and I gladly volunteered. I enjoyed my tour over there. When I first got to Vietnam, I had nobody assigned to me. They were all en route. They had just created the position actually a few weeks earlier. And it was rather interesting. I needed some darkroom equipment. I went out I saw an Army photo detachment to say, "You fellows have any spare equipment?" They said, "Sure, you got any spare plywood?" Well, that's how things were done in Vietnam. The Navy calls that cumshaw. So I went back to my supply officer, was able to get them 10 or 15 sheets of half-inch plywood, and they gave me some equipment. I went to an Army base, an Air Force base. Talked to a master sergeant, "Have you got any spare photo equipment?" He says, "Lieutenant, I've got a film dryer over here. Have you got a case of sea rations?" I think they call that MRI today, meals ready to eat. Back in Vietnam, it was sea rations. So we got the photo lab up. I got my men in, and our job was to public affairs, public relations for the Navy. One of the things that we did a little bit differently, each branch of the service wants to recognize its men, and one of the ways they do that is I'm sure you've seen it in the newspapers. Back on page 24, there'll be a little 2 sentences saying, "John Jones, son of Dr. and Mrs. Ralph Jones of such and such a street, such and such a city, was recently promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class. He's serving at the U.S. Naval Base, Great Lakes, Illinois." Well, I wanted to do more than that. So before I went to Vietnam, I purchased a book called Ayer's Newspaper Guide. And instead of sending out a two-sentence item on every one of our men, we had three pages that went out. And the first paragraph was all about the man, his school, and more detail than that he was just the son of somebody. And the next 2 pages were all about our mission. And we included a photo of the man and a couple of action photos. Newspapers are under no obligation to print anything unless you're paying for it. And I realized that. So I sent a little note with all of these to the newspapers, the weeklies, the dailies in that man's hometown. And a little note said, basically, "Editor, I know you're under no obligation to publish this, but if you do, will you send me a tear sheet? Because I put it in the chow hall and it helps morale." And I even sent along an envelope, pre-addressed. And they came back to me in hordes. And I did. I ran them by my CO first to let him know I was doing my job, and then put them up in the chow hall. And it helped morale tremendously. In fact, there was one helicopter pilot from Cape May, New Jersey, and he got a couple promotions while he was there, a couple awards, and I sent those back to the newspaper in Cape May, and one day he said, "Len, the governor of New Jersey just sent my wife a dozen red roses to show his appreciation for what I'm doing over here, what the Navy's doing." So that was one of the things we did. I remember spending New Year's Eve 1968 at a base camp with a war correspondent from the Long Beach Telegraph, the Navy did provide us with 1 beer for that evening. The unique thing was that right at the stroke of midnight, you would have felt it was 4th of July. I'm sure all branches of the service probably shot off $2 or $3 million worth of ammunition just to celebrate the new year. But it was an interesting year. You've all heard Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes is a military publication, and I noticed in Vietnam that the Army and the Air Force and the Marines were getting all the coverage in the Stars and Stripes. So I contacted the editors and said, hey, we got a lot of Navy in country too. How about a little publicity? He said, well, okay, you got a story for us. I said, well, yeah, I've got a base camp. He said, oh. So we made arrangements for them to come to one of our base camps. It was on the Cambodian border. And again, there were no roads in Vietnam. You had to get either fly where you were going or take a boat. And they asked me how they were going to get to this particular base camp. I said, well, I happen to know Admiral Zumwalt's schedule, and he is going to be at, I can't remember the name of the place, but at a certain little town. And he's leaving there at 8 in the morning, Thursday morning. So if you have your Stars and Stripes photojournalist team there, they better be out at the plane at 7 o'clock in case he leaves early and he's coming to the base camp that I'm at. Well, later in the morning I got a call and he says the Admiral changed his plans and we've got the photojournalist team stuck in that little town, and how do they get to you? Well, we happen to have a riverboat detachment at that town also. But I had them, I said, well, the best way of doing it, I will make arrangements for a riverboat to get you from that town to where we are. In fact, about midway we'll meet. I'll have a boat go out and we'll just have you hop from one boat to another. And while we were en route to rendezvous to pick up the Stars and Stripes photography team, we were ambushed. We took 2 B-40 rockets. The boats that we were in, they were 31-foot fiberglass boats, so they didn't stop bullets too well, or rockets. The boatswain mate next to me was killed. Several were the crew members. There were only about 4 crew members, but a couple of them were wounded, and one of them wounded to the point where he was given a military discharge. I was wearing this, thank goodness, and this is a flak jacket, and that's what it looked like as I was evacuated to a medical evacuation helicopter. The Army and the Air Force had medical evacuation helicopters in the air most of the time during the daytime hours in Vietnam, and at nighttime if they needed them. The Army called theirs Dust Off, and the Air Force were Pedro. So when we were wounded, when I was wounded, they put out a call to the closest Pedro or Dust Off, gave them our coordinates, and a Dust Off was there within a matter of minutes. And within 20 minutes from the time that we were ambushed, I was in an Army hospital at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, and that we were at the Cambodian border. So I've got the highest praise for the Army and the Air Force for their medical evacuation efforts.
Wow. Now, what was this, shrapnel or bullets? Or?
It was shrapnel. Right. This was shrapnel from a B-40 rocket. Like I say, one was below the water line. This would have been the one above the water line. In an interesting story, I was at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. My brother-in-law happened to be an Army colonel, and he was at Pleiku at the same time. So I called him from the Army hospital and asked him when he was coming to Saigon again. He said, well, I've got to be there in a couple of weeks. Why do you ask? I said, well, I'm here now, but I'm not going to be here in a couple of weeks. And a little conversation, he realized that I was wounded. He said, I'll be there tomorrow. So he came and we chatted. I said, now don't let Mom and Dad know that I'm wounded, because all they can do is worry. There's nothing they can do. I'm all right, you can see, I've got all my limbs. And he said, I'll keep it a secret. So went the next day, I was medevaced, and I went to Japan, Yokosuka Naval Hospital. I was there for 2 months. But after a while, I could get around, and I decided I wanted to go to the exchange and buy some things, but I didn't have much money. And I contacted my mom and dad, sent them a letter and said, can you put a little money in my, I think I had a Chase Manhattan checking account, can you put it in about $700 in there for me? Which they did. And I told them I was on special assignment. And if you were to write back to me, it was in care of the Public Affairs Office for Commander Naval Forces Japan, FPO Box such and such. And we corresponded for 2 months. When I'm getting ready to go back to Vietnam, I thought, well, I'd like to talk to mom and dad. I was single at the time, so no wife. And I made a long distance phone call. And one of the first things mom had to say to me was, you're wounded, aren't you? I said, Mom, why in the world would you say something like that? I've told you I'm on special assignment. What gave you that idea? She says, because every one of your letters is postmarked U.S. Navy Hospital. So, so mom's intuition, she found out.